Evander Holyfield fought everyone. That is the line that defines his career and separates him from every other heavyweight champion of his era. 44 wins, 10 losses, 57 professional fights across 27 years. 4 heavyweight world titles. The only man in history to become undisputed champion at both cruiserweight and heavyweight in the three-belt era. He fought Mike Tyson. He fought Lennox Lewis. He fought George Foreman at 42 years old and Riddick Bowe 3 times, and kept fighting long after everyone around him said it was time to stop. But fighting everyone is not the same as wanting to fight everyone. And at 63 years old, Evander Holyfield has been direct about something he rarely admitted during his career. The 5 fighters he faced, who he genuinely wished he never had to face. Not because he feared them, because each of those fights cost him something specific that had nothing to do with the outcome on the scorecards. These are those 5 fighters, and the story behind each one reveals a side of Holyfield that the record alone never captured. Number 5. Mike Tyson. The most surprising thing Evander Holyfield ever said about Mike Tyson was not about the ear. It was not about the 1996 knockout, or the infamous 1997 disqualification, or the years of manufactured build-up that made their first meeting the most anticipated boxing match of the decade. It was something much simpler that he said in a Boxing Insider interview that almost nobody noticed. There's not a fighter out there who I had a goal to fight them. I never had a goal to fight Mike. I had a goal to win the heavyweight championship. That sentence contains everything. Holyfield never wanted to fight Mike Tyson. He wanted to be undisputed heavyweight champion, and Mike Tyson happened to be the man standing between him and that goal. At the moment it became achievable. The distinction matters enormously because it reframes the entire mythology around one of boxing's most celebrated grudge matches. The fight was supposed to happen in 1991. Tyson suffered a rib injury in training, and it was postponed. Then Tyson went to prison in 1992, serving 3 years at the Indiana Youth Center on a rape conviction. When Tyson finally returned to boxing in 1995, the commercial machinery that had been building this fight for years moved back into gear, and Holyfield found himself in the position of facing the most feared man in boxing almost regardless of whether the timing or the circumstances were right. Holyfield beat Tyson by technical knockout in the 11th round on November 9, 1996, a result that stunned the boxing world but did not surprise Holyfield, who had spent months convincing himself and his team that Tyson's psychological advantages evaporated when someone refused to be intimidated. The rematch on June 28, 1997, ended when Tyson bit off a piece of Holyfield's right ear, spat the cartilage on the canvas, and was disqualified in the 3rd round. Holyfield famously said afterward that he forgave Tyson, and his Christian faith made that forgiveness genuine rather than rhetorical. But forgiving someone is different from wanting to have faced them in the first place. Holyfield never wanted the Tyson fight specifically. He wanted the championship that Tyson happened to be holding at the relevant moment. That distinction was his own, stated plainly in his own words. Number 5. The fight he needed to have, not the fight he ever wanted. Number 4. Lennox Lewis, March 13, 1999. Madison Square Garden, New York City. Evander Holyfield versus Lennox Lewis for the unified WBA, WBC, and IBF Heavyweight Championship of the world. The biggest heavyweight unification fight in years, billed as undisputed. 2 champions who each held major belts, meeting to settle which man was the legitimate heavyweight king. After 12 rounds, the scorecards were announced. Judge Eugenia Williams scored it 115 to 113 for Holyfield. Judge Larry O'Connell scored it 115 to 113 for Lewis, and Judge Stanley Christodoulou scored it 114 to 114. A draw. Split draw. The Madison Square Garden crowd erupted in outrage. Most ringside observers believed Lewis had clearly won. The WBC launched an immediate investigation into the judging. Holyfield never accepted the draw as a fair result either, but for the opposite reason. He believed he had done enough to win. He said in interviews afterward, "I do not lose. I just do not get decisions sometimes." That sentence, which became one of the defining quotes of his entire career, was directed at precisely this moment. He had walked into Madison Square Garden intending to prove he was still the definitive heavyweight champion of the world. He walked out with a draw that satisfied nobody, including himself. The rematch came 8 months later on November 13th, 1999, and Lewis won by unanimous decision, stripping Holyfield of his WBA and IBF titles. 3 judges, 3 scorecards for Lewis. The unfinished business from March was finally settled. Against Holyfield, definitively and without controversy. What made the Lewis fights the ones Holyfield wished had gone differently was not simply the results. It was the timing. Holyfield was 36 years old at the time of their first fight. The draw denied him a clean resolution at a moment when his body still had enough left to produce one. The rematch loss, coming 8 months later, confirmed what the draw had hinted at, that the version of Holyfield capable of winning those fights had a narrower window than he had allowed for. Holyfield said publicly that he felt he had done enough to win in March 1999. The record says draw. The rematch says Lewis. And Holyfield spent years afterwards saying, in different ways, what his career-defining quote had already established, that losing and not getting the decision were 2 entirely different things in his mind, and that the Lewis chapter contained more of the latter than he was ever willing to fully accept. Number 4. The fights that Holyfield wishes had produced the definitive answer he believed he had earned, and that the judging in March 1999 denied him the chance to claim. Number 3. James Toney, October 4, 2003. Madison Square Garden, New York City. Evander Holyfield was 40 years old. James Toney was 35. Holyfield had lost 2 consecutive fights before this one, a majority decision to Chris Bird in December 2002, and before that a close decision to Brian Nielsen. He was fighting without the New York State Athletic Commission's blessing, having been flagged for diminished skills despite passing all required medical tests. Toney hit him for 9 rounds. Not spectacular, sweeping power shots, but the accumulated work of a ring-wise technician who spent every round finding openings that Holyfield's slowed reflexes could no longer close in time. In the 9th round, Holyfield's corner threw in the towel. Technical knockout, his 3rd consecutive defeat. Holyfield said nothing dramatic afterward. He acknowledged that his shoulder had been causing problems, that the injuries which had accumulated across decades of championship fighting were presenting themselves simultaneously in ways that affected his performance. He talked about coming back. He always talked about coming back. But James Toney represented something specific that Holyfield had never faced before and never wanted to face. A fighter who was simply better than the version of Holyfield that showed up that night. Not because Holyfield lacked heart or preparation or will, but because the body that had carried him through 30 years of elite competition was no longer the body that had beaten Tyson and Foreman and Bowe. Toney showed Holyfield the truth of his own decline in the most direct way the sport allows. Number 3. The fight that made it undeniable. Number 2. Riddick Bowe. Evander Holyfield has said, publicly and on multiple occasions, that the one fighter he regrets facing most is Riddick Bowe. Not because Bowe beat him. He also beat Lennox Lewis, and Bowe won 2 of 3 fights between them. Because of the reason he gave for the regret, which has nothing to do with boxing at all. Speaking on the Big Podcast with Shaq, Holyfield explained, "Riddick Bowe is the first person that I didn't listen to what my mama told me. My mama told me not to become friends with people you're going to compete with. She said, son, when you're friends with people like that, you tell them too much." And in a separate interview with DJ Vlad, he elaborated, "The big thing with Bowe, he's the first person I realized that I didn't do what my mama told me to do." Holyfield and Bowe were friends before they were rivals. They had trained together, spent time in each other's company, during the years when Bowe was a prospect and Holyfield was already a champion. The friendship created an intimacy that Holyfield's mother had specifically warned him against. The kind of familiarity that allows a future opponent to see not just your boxing, but who you are under pressure, what you respond to, what you avoid, how you think. Their first fight on November 13th, 1992, at the Thomas and Mack Center in Las Vegas, ended with Holyfield losing the undisputed heavyweight title by unanimous decision. Bowe knew him too well, knew where the openings were, knew what worked against him in ways that a stranger could not have known. Holyfield has never said it directly in those terms, but the logic of his mother's advice, which he acknowledged ignoring, points precisely there. The trilogy extended to November 1995, when Bowe stopped Holyfield in the 8th round in a non-title fight at Caesar's Palace. 3 fights, 2 losses, and the persistent belief in Holyfield's own words that it could have gone differently if he had simply listened to his mother in the years before they ever shared a ring. Number 2, the fight he regrets most, the friend he should never have made. Number 1, the third Bowe fight. If Holyfield regrets the Bowe trilogy in general, one specific moment within it stands apart from everything else in his career as the fight he most clearly wished he had never taken. Not the first Bowe fight, despite the lost title. Not the second, despite the parachutist chaos. The third fight in November 1995 at Caesar's Palace, and the reason for the regret has nothing to do with the outcome on the night. In the weeks leading up to that fight, Holyfield contracted hepatitis. His doctor told him plainly, "Evander, you don't want to go in like that." Holyfield's response, which he shared in an interview years later, was entirely characteristic of who he was as a fighter. "I started saying you don't understand. That's $9 million. I had never pulled out of a fight a day in my life. I had already trained 10 weeks and only had 3 more weeks to go." The doctor told him the illness would affect him for at least a week. Holyfield reasoned he had 2 weeks until the fight, which he calculated as sufficient recovery time. It was not sufficient. Holyfield fought Bowe ill, exhausted, and physically compromised in ways that no amount of preparation or willpower could fully overcome. Bowe stopped him in the 8th round, the first time any fighter had ever stopped Evander Holyfield, the first TKO loss of his career. Holyfield admitted the miscalculation himself years later, with the specific honesty of a man who had spent enough time with the decision to understand exactly what had gone wrong. "Doing the very best I could, but I got tore up that time." The $9 million he received was, in his own assessment, not worth the physical cost of fighting Riddick Bowe while infected with hepatitis. The fight ended the trilogy and closed a chapter of his career in the worst possible way. Not through a fair test of 2 healthy athletes, but through the stubbornness of a man who had never quit anything and could not bring himself to start. Number 1, not the fight he feared, the fight he should have delayed, could have delayed, and chose not to delay for reasons that made financial sense and career sense, but no medical sense at all. Evander Holyfield at his most human, stubborn, proud, and paying the full price for both. Evander Holyfield fought everyone. That will always be the defining truth of his career. But fighting everyone is not the same as wanting to fight everyone. And at 63 years old, the 4-time heavyweight champion of the world has been honest about the 5 occasions when he faced opponents or circumstances that he genuinely wished had been different. Mike Tyson, the fight he needed but never specifically wanted. Floyd Mayweather, the fighter whose entire approach to the sport represented the opposite of everything Holyfield believed a champion should be. James Toney, the night the body told the truth that pride refused to acknowledge. Riddick Bowe, the friend his mother had warned him never to make. And the third Bowe fight, $9 million, a hepatitis diagnosis, a doctor's warning ignored, and the first stoppage loss of his entire career. 5 fights. 5 regrets from a man who almost never had any. That is what 63 years and 27 years of professional boxing eventually produces. Not just the record, but the honest accounting of what it cost to build it.